Welcome to your final unit on agriculture and your second and final lecture related to agriculture. Before we begin, I want to point out how important it is to read the articles posted on D2L. These articles relate to this lecture, and these articles are going to be part of your quiz. So it's very important that you read these in conjunction with this lecture. This lecture is going to relate to the readings on D2L, and those readings come from a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma. This is probably one of my better liked books of all time. It's a really great book that gets into humans and how humans are omnivores and how we have such a wide selection of foods, and how with all the food available to us today we've run into a few problems. It's very good. It's done in a well-balanced manner. I would recommend reading it, especially if you like the 3 chapters that came from this book. In that book, especially in the chapters that you read, there's a great deal of emphasis on industrial food production. In the case of those chapters, mainly on industrial beef production. And what Michael Pollan looks at in a lot of ways is how from before we had this type of food production, it used to take a steer several years to get up to 1,100 pounds, large enough for slaughter. Now we can do that. We can go from 80 to 1,100 pounds in just over a year. So how do we do that? We do that by feeding those animals lots and lots of starches, fattening them up with saturated fats by giving them corn. We give them lots of protein. And the way we give them protein is we actually give them ground up animal. Now I'm not in this lecture to tell you any way, shape, or form what to think, but at the same time, when it comes to something like grinding up an animal and putting it into an animal's feed, especially an herbivore, you run into some issues with potential diseases, as we've seen with things like mad cow disease. Now it's illegal to feed animals brain material or spinal material, but you can still feed them ground up bone and I believe blood. So that's how these animals are getting protein to bulk them up really fast. And the same thing with fat. You can give them fat to fatten them up. Drugs, these animals are given lots of drugs. Now they're given synthetic estrogen in the case of dairy cattle, but they're also given lots of antibiotics. We're going to visit antibiotics in the next few slides because antibiotics are there and because of the fact that these animals, their stomachs can't really handle that corn. And for those of you who follow antibiotic issues within the medical field, we know that there's a push against overprescribing antibiotics with humans. Well, in the animal world, that push has somehow escaped the public eye. And what's going on in these animal operations is lots of these animals are becoming more and more resistant to the antibiotics. That has a lot of disease type people quite worried, because if those antibiotics that aren't working anymore develop into a disease that can't be treated, that can hurt the animal industry. But not only that, that disease could jump from the animal world into the human world and create a lot of potential problems because it would be resistant to so many antibiotics. And then finally, they're given liquid vitamins. That's how you get the steer that large. Now I don't want to get into this in too much detail because in your reading you're going to cover this in much more detail. This is pokey feeders. Now you might remember visiting such places in Google Earth, but this is the type of operation that you would see in the modern industrial landscape. It used to be that this is what you would see in the holding yards in Chicago. And all of those animals that were raised their entire lives on ranches are driven to places like Dodge City, Kansas City, and then transported via railroad to the holding yards in Chicago for slaughter. Now what we have is a very different situation, to where these animals now are raised the first few months of their life on ranches, but then they're taken to these areas and the rest of their lives they eat corn. Now the corn gives them a limited lifespan. Why do they have a limited lifespan in corn? Because cattle cannot eat corn, to answer the question on top. When you give animals their own, when you force cannibalism, you have animals eat their own flesh, especially brains, spinal cord material, you're breaking a lot of evolutionary links. And it's just, if you look at many different species out there, they don't engage in cannibalism, especially humans, because it's well known that this is an excellent conveyor of transmitting disease. With corn, what we've done is we've broken another evolutionary link by acidifying the rumen. Corn creates a very acidic environment in the stomach of these animals. You saw this in the video Food Incorporated, and you're going to read about that more in your readings. But with corn, these cattle are meant to process grass. They evolved eating grass, and by giving them corn, we bulk them up very fast. But at the same time, there's a cost to where they develop massive ulcers in their stomachs. And when those ulcers come along, this is how things like E. coli develop. E. coli isn't something that was always around in cattle. E. coli is a byproduct of all the corn in these animals' systems. So to combat that, as we saw in the video, what we'll do is we employ different forms of technology. Instead of cutting back on the amount of corn, which would lengthen the time to bring those animals to market, we'll do things like radiate the meat, or we'll take the meat and soak it in ammonium hydroxide. You might remember that from the Food Incorporated video. Then we put that in, and that's a means to stave off bacterial infection by things like E. coli and other negative bacteria that are found in the stomach that can contaminate the meat source. Unfortunately, that's not 100% effective, and we still have many outbreaks of food poisoning illness every year. Another thing with corn is that we have to look at corn in the perspective of now competing with ethanol production, but also in terms of moving up the food chain. Because the higher you move up the food chain, the more energy is consumed. If we look at Steer 534 from the Michael Pollan book, that thing is eating 25 pounds of corn a day. Now, corn is in parentheses because you have to remember it has protein and fat and vitamins and antibiotics and all sorts of good things in it as well. If you look at that corn, though, and the energy that goes into producing that corn, you're talking about 35 gallons of oil per the lifetime of the steer. Let's take this into a geopolitics or military geographic situation, or just in terms of a humanitarian situation. If we look at production in the United States, we have North and Central America here, but this is predominantly the United States and Canada. We look at grain production, and we produce so much grain in our country that we export it. Or in the case of right now, we're converting that into ethanol and into byproducts such as high fructose corn syrup. But the point is that we don't have to import any food. That's a good thing. However, let's look over at Asia. Now, Asia produces even more food than the United States. Nearly double of what the United States produces. However, despite that production of food, they have to import some of their food. Now let's take a look at this over in terms of what Asia is doing in terms of how they use it. We look at North and Central America, Canada, the United States, Mexico, predominantly the United States. And the majority of our corn grain that we raise goes into animal feed. We look at this, we have some seed processing waste, that's things like corn syrup and everything. This is only how much we eat of our grains as actual food. Look over at Asia. Asia uses very little for animal feed, and by far, well over 3/4 goes towards direct consumption of food. They're directly eating the grains. Now, why is that a big deal? Because going back to some of the readings that you had at the very beginning of the semester when you looked at things like water issues and the like, This means that as Asian countries such as China and India become more and more wealthy, Vietnam, these countries are going to start consuming more and more meat. And if they're consuming more and more meat, where is that grain going to come from if they're having to import it already? That means that now they're going to call on places like North America to do that. But if we're doing all that production in ethanol, we're going to have a little bit of a situation going on to where there's not enough to go around. This has a lot of people in the military strategy world, intelligence community, humanitarian agencies quite worried in terms of what we have going on with our grain production and using it for animal feed. So let's talk about corn a little bit more. In terms of corn consumption, the United States leads the world in corn consumption. Corn is not what you would think of just eating in your Wheaties. Wheaties is actually made from wheat and your cornflakes. Corn is everywhere. How is corn everywhere? You saw this a little bit in the video, but it's a byproduct in a lot of foods. Whether or not it's a starch for holding together an item, even your silverware and your cups these days, or everyone's familiar with high fructose corn syrup. Over 25% of items in the supermarket contain corn. If you start getting in the middle aisles where food is processed, you're talking over 90%. Other materials, non-food, well, you might remember from the video, many items out there have some type of a corn product in there. Corn is almost like a lumber product for us that's so ubiquitous in the United States. So you might want to look at the reading post of the D2L related to this as well. When it comes to corn, we have to relate this to the nitrogen cycle. I talked about this a little bit before when we were looking at the graphs in the first lecture, but until we were able to introduce nitrogen in an artificial, in a synthetic way into the nitrogen cycle, the plant that you're looking at right here was how we would restore nitrogen to the soil. You would let a field go fallow to bring the nitrogen back, where you would have naturally occurring plants like this, or you might decide to plant it with a legume or your beans. And legumes have bacteria that hang out by the roots, and they take nitrogen and they put it into a form that can be readily taken up by plants. So soybeans are actually a legume that'll restore nitrogen into the soil, but nowhere near as effective as synthetic fertilizers. Now, humans have altered the cycle for years with cultivated nitrogen fixing crops such as your beans and your peanuts. But synthetic fertilizers have completely turned the nitrogen cycle on its end. What we've done over the past even just 60 years in terms of the nitrogen cycle with synthetic fertilizers is we have now input more nitrogen into the nitrogen cycle than all natural processes combined. We always hear about carbon in the atmosphere. We always hear about CO2 getting fixated in the oceans, but very little emphasis is put in attention on how much nitrogen we put in the atmosphere and into our waterways and into our soil. And this comes about because of our ability to synthetically produce nitrogen-based fertilizers. Nitrogen cycle. If there was one person who was more influential in the course of the 20th century, and I would argue one of the top 5 in human history, it would be Fritz Haber. Now, Fritz Haber was a German biochemist who used organic chemistry to develop many different innovations in history. He more notoriously is responsible for the development of things like Cyclone B and phosgene gas during World War I, but prior to World War I, he's the one who came up with the way to convert nitrogen into a form synthetically that can be taken in by plants. This is referred to as the Haber-Bosch process. Carl Bosch was the person who was more on the mass production side of things. But the Haber-Bosch process really changed the course of history because with that ability, now we were no longer limited to plants putting nitrogen back in the soil and a crop rotation system. Now what we could do is increase yield merely by putting the synthetic fertilizer into areas that were depleted by nitrogen depleting plants like corn and cotton and tobacco. This was developed prior to World War I. During World War I, Haber was involved with the poison gas production and the like. This process was also a way to mass produce lots of explosives. And so in World War II, we were making ammonium nitrate for the purpose of explosive munitions. So in the Gulf Coast region, we developed this massive amount of production, which really no one in the private sector would ever want to have done to make fertilizer prior to World War II, and we were engaged in making munitions. Now after World War II, we had a glut of explosive munitions left, a glut of ammonium nitrate. Instead of just getting rid of that ammonium nitrate, we decided that we were going to use it to make fertilizer. So a lot of these munitions factories, these explosive factories, were changed into fertilizer factories to make ammonium nitrate, which is your synthetic fertilizer. That is why, if you remember that previous graph, where we had that large rise in yield right around the end of World War II. This brings us into a nitrogen dilemma now, because the nitrogen dilemma is that we're making this stuff from a non-renewable resource. Not only that, we're putting a lot of nitrogen into the atmosphere. Nitrogen requires fossil fuel. It's made from natural gas and oil. Or not nitrogen, but nitrogen-based synthetic fertilizer. This fertilizer can run off into rivers, as we're going to see, creating implications, but you have to remember that what this stuff is being made from is a non-renewable resource, and the cost of oil has gone up significantly, which means the cost of these fertilizers is going to go up significantly. If we look at the Haber-Bosch process in fossil fuels, we can see where we have a current agricultural model that is inefficient calorie-wise. Because if it takes 10 to 15 calories of fossil fuel energy to create 1 calorie of food, what we have is we have more input going in than output. And this ratio is actually getting more and more skewed. If we look at this from an energy perspective, it's about 396 gallons of oil to feed each American annually. And I say it's too bad we can't drink oil, because a half a gallon of oil is about a bushel of corn. This is the other problem with the nitrogen, is that we have a flood of synthetic nitrogen going into our rivers. So here we have Iowa City. Iowa City is a city that yearly suffers from water quality issues because of the glut of nitrogen in their water supply. They issue things like blue baby alerts. There's issues with too much nitrogen in the blood. But if you look at why, and this is just Iowa, but all of those little green squares, that's all fields that all have a high amount of nitrogen-based fertilizer going on them. That all flows into the Mississippi River. And when that happens, whenever you get an excessive amount of nitrogen or phosphorus, you can get these algal blooms. And when those blooms occur, you get these lakes eutrophying or filling in with vegetation. When they fill in with vegetation like that, you're reducing the amount of sunlight. And when that sunlight is gone, now a lot of organisms that rely on sunlight to produce their own energy can't get it. Not only that, the algae and the organisms surrounded with that are consuming a lot of the oxygen. That means you have a loss of aquatic habitat, and you have a decrease in the dissolved oxygen in the water. This leads to a condition called hypoxia. And so if we look at this in terms of runoff from developed lands, we can see that this area in our corn belt is where a lot of that runoff is coming. And so all of that runoff is going from all these hundreds and thousands of little streams and ending up in the Mississippi River, and concentrating until it goes out here into the Gulf of Mexico and you get these massive algal blooms in these massive hypoxic zones. So here's what that hypoxic zone would look like in the Gulf. Now every spring this occurs. It depends on how much rainfall and how much snowfall you have that winter in terms of the size of the hypoxic zone. But in 1999, this thing was nearly 8,000 square miles big. Where's the primary input of that? It's from fertilizer and mineralized soil nitrogen, and of course animal manure, which is related to that. This is an issue, and this is not just an issue that occurs in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a global phenomenon. Now you'll notice that I have a link to this. I would encourage you to look at this actual lecture and click on this link and look a bit more into these different hypoxic zones, but these are all over the world. This occurs in the Chesapeake Bay. We'll visit that when we get into our water unit. This is occurring in places like the Puget Sound of Washington, and it's becoming a big dilemma in China and in Northern Europe. You look at this is your eutrophication, your dead zone, which is your hypoxic zone, and you look at this in relation to the human footprint, and we can see how the human footprint relates to hypoxia on the landscape. Now let's look at another facet of the Green Revolution, and that's GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. It's really best to label a GMO as a transgenic organism and transgenic plant and not a GMO, because GMO, you could just have it in terms of just selecting the best pumpkin year after year. You're really genetically modifying that, but you're just doing it through a selection process. Transgenic means that you're splicing the gene, and that's what transgenic crops are. We've often heard of BT corn or BT cotton, and what you do is you're taking this bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, and you're taking a protein from that toxic to certain insects like corn borers, like Colorado potato beetles, and you're splicing that into the gene, and that gene is now in the corn seed, and when that caterpillar eats the plant, its guts get affected by that and it will die. That's what a transgenic crop is. And now there's different types of transgenic. There's been work with taking genes from flounder and putting it into tomatoes to make them frost effective. Lots of controversy with transgenic crops. Now, why is there a controversy? Well, there's three worries, and these worries in a lot of ways are unfounded and founded. The first worry is that innocent creatures will be hurt by insecticides built into the many GM crops. So BT could impact things like bees. We'll visit that potentially down the road. And there was talk about how butterflies, such as monarch butterflies, were harmed, but really that study ended up being flawed, and it really doesn't make sense, because a monarch butterfly caterpillar is not going to eat corn, it's going to eat milkweed. So there's both hype and fact behind innocent creatures getting hurt, but there's different forms of science that will give you varying opinions on that. The second is superweeds will arise, and there's a lot of truth in this, in that when we make BT crops, or when we make transgenic crops, we do things that make them such as Roundup ready. And if you have something Roundup ready, that means that the other weeds are theoretically going to get destroyed by the Roundup while the corn lives, or the soy crop lives. The issue there is what happens if those weeds start to build up resistance, and we're relying on a herbicide or a pesticide, and you can't treat it down the road. And finally, GM crops are going to fail because of some big epidemic, and we're not going to be able to keep up with changing. These are all issues, and this is all speculation, and some data exists to support it. But the fact of the matter is that transgenic crops are within our system, and they're very likely not going to go away. If you look at the latest crop of numbers related to this, actually not the latest, this is from back in 2000, but if we look at who is producing transgenic crops, it is the United States. and Argentina. Now China is getting more and more into this, but the United States by far leads the world in the technology and the implementation of these crops. Sometimes we've rejected the crops, such as with the potato, we've rejected BT potatoes, but for the most part, we use a lot of transgenic technology. Now the majority, if we look at the most common GM crops, soybeans by far lead the way, followed by corn. If we look at this by trait, we would see that the majority of transgenic crops are actually for herbicide tolerance. You have insect resistance, such as the BT corn, and then you also have some that are both. What we're not seeing, though, is the transgenic crops that do things like are drought resistant, and that's where a lot of criticism comes in with transgenic research, is because there's a large call for more resistance to things like drought rather than looking at this in terms of yield potential. The other issue with transgenic crops is the CCD mystery with bees, and that's colony collapse disorder. There's been a large amount of research that's saying that BT technology might be linked to colony collapse disorder. However, more research points that it's simple herbicide and pesticide use that is impacting these bees. I would encourage you to go to these two websites to take a look at some of the information behind that, but bees in this country are definitely suffering. In the future, I plan on making an entirely different lecture related to this, but for now, we're just going to leave it at this. So what are the solutions to this dilemma that we're in? Well, we saw the Green Revolution in the 1960s, but now we have something called the New Green Revolution. And the New Green Revolution is a revolution that is embracing technology, but at the same time very much looking at how we use soils in the landscape differently. The first one is genetic engineering. Now you just saw how I was talking about transgenic crops and how there's so much surrounding them, but more and more people who are involved at looking at how we're going to be able to feed our current population and growing population. If we look at how that technology can be applied, we see that it's going to be genetic engineering that's going to help us stave off the need for heavy amounts of fertilizer and high amounts of irrigation. We can genetically engineer crops potentially to grow in colder weather, to grow under drought conditions, to grow under conditions that might have a little more salt in the soil than otherwise. This is a type of genetic research that's possible. However, the majority of the genetic engineering right now is going more towards yield potential. So genetic engineering, it can be in both the former Green Revolution and the New Green Revolution. There's also a new sustainable agriculture movement. This gets into soil conservation measures, which we talked about in the soils lecture. It gets into integrated farming and polyculture. You're going to read about that in your Michael Pollan chapters. Managing the topography related to soil conservation, providing ground cover, intercropping, growing crops within one another. So if you have an olive orchard, you can graze cattle, you can grow tomatoes within that olive orchard. Reducing tillage. Now reducing tillage has its drawbacks, but if you look at reducing tillage in things like orchard operations, in some operations that you don't really have a pest issue, especially if you don't have so much monoculture, reducing tillage is a solution. And finally, low input sustainable agriculture. This gets into things like integrated pest management. You're not necessarily going organic, but at the same time, you're only applying those materials in areas that are needed. So this is all part of sustainable agriculture. Can we make agriculture sustainable? The new push right now is local versus organic. The older movement was organic, but now more and more people are saying, hey, it's not so much organic, because if you're having asparagus flown in 6,000 miles from Argentina in the wintertime just so you can have organic asparagus, there might be some issues with that, and might it be better to engage in local agriculture? And so now there's a whole new group of people called localvores that try to buy locally as much as possible. And there's a large amount of debate on this as well. You can relate to this to the Food Incorporated video, to where you were looking at, well, isn't it better to do things like sell to Walmart or not? And really the debate is open to this. And if you were to have my opinion on this, I think one of the best things people can do is just understand where their food is coming from, but also make an attempt to grow your own food. So what is organic? Organic is food produced without hormones, antibiotics, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, or genetic modification. In order to become organic, you have to be USDA certified. This can be a very arduous process, and there are many growers, especially your smaller local growers, who just don't have time to engage in this. And so what they'll often do is just self-label their food sustainably produced. Once again, this gets into the big organic debate in terms of sometimes these organic practices can be almost, I shouldn't say environmentally detrimental, but not the non-organic really isn't as bad as what people tend to think of non-organic as being. And also, it's very difficult sometimes if you're a smaller grower to go through all these compliances to become totally organic. And once again, this gets into, well, is it better to be organic or is it better to be local? The three goals with the organic movement to begin with was a non-industrial approach, which is good for the environment, to distribute the food accordingly and to provide nutritious foods. But what we've seen with the organic movement is that the organic movement can very much be industrial. And getting into that Food Incorporated video, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? You had a discussion forum with that. So why local? Well, if you start looking at the distance to market, we can start to see that when you start taking these materials, if these were organic and you start getting organic grapes from California, well, now you're running into a situation where that material has to travel quite far to get to you. Would it be better instead to have a local asparagus grower and to have the asparagus in season? I'm not telling you this. What I'm asking you to do is to think about this a little bit critically and don't necessarily place yourself into one camp without kind of thinking out the information and deciding, well, where do you lie in this debate? I also mentioned integrated farming. This is called polyculture agriculture. This is something that you read about in your Michael Pullen article with Polyface Farms, but there's also something called the Igamo method, and that comes from Japan, where you had fish, rice, and chickens all in the same area, to where you had fertilization from the chickens and the fish lived in the rice, and it was all very much a closed system with nutrients being supplied by all. That's the goal of Polyface Farms as well. You can also see this in urban operations such as Growing Power in Milwaukee, to where they have arugula lettuce growing that's being fertilized by tanks of tilapia underneath. It's a very interesting place. I would encourage you to visit this Growing Power if you ever get the chance in the future.